Hello, everyone. We have on Alliance at Cosmopolis YouTube channel today with us Mr. Anirudh Kanisetti, who was a beloved young historian of South India and perhaps of other parts of India as well, as he has written numerous columns and pieces on South Asia's history in digital platforms like The Print, and also has a book coming out, which has already come out, The Lords of the Deccan, Southern India from the Chalukyas to the Cholas, which is a wonderful read, I must say, on an often ignored, or if I may, taken for granted, if I have to use Peter Frankopan's words, period in Indian history of the Chalukyas and Cholas and many other kingdoms who were engaged in a complex tug of war in the medieval period. To start off with, Anirudh, I have to say, you have a very unconventional route that you have taken to become this public intellectual historian in India. You were a podcaster first, then as a public intellectual, you wrote columns and opinion pieces and articles in digital platforms, and then have finally turned to print medium. So how do you trace this journey, and how do you feel about this? What do you feel about this unconventional journey?
Well, let me begin by thanking you, Liju. Thank you so much for your kind words in introducing me. And thanks, of course, to Alliance University for having me here on Cosmopolis. To answer your question, it's really not something that I set out to do. I think, like many young South Indian men, I wanted to be the next Satya Nadella and do my engineering, do my MBA, and settle down in the US. But I think during engineering, I realized that might not necessarily be the path for me. I did a minor in philosophy, economics, and politics, which I think was really my first introduction to the liberal arts. And I found that it really, really broadened my world and made me think about the way the world is the way it is in more critical ways. And it, of course, also introduced me to the enormous wealth of academic historical literature that is out there in South India. Which oddly enough hasn't really bridged the gap into popular history, as it were. Something I recognized when I used to play a lot of games when I was in college, I think as all of us do. And I would play a lot of games about, medieval Europe, ancient Europe. So I'd be playing
Age
about
of Empires?
Age of Empires, yes. Also the Total War series. So a lot of games that Greece and Rome and all these other medieval European kingdoms feature on. And if I were to, for example, search for a book about Alexander the Great, I would find a million fairly well-written, fairly critical works. But if I were to search for example, Chandragupta Maurya, I would find maybe one or two dense academic tomes, but really not a lot of pop history work. So I started to blog, and I realized I had a bit of a flair for reading historical research and then presenting it in this kind of narrative format. So in 2017, when I was doing my first job in Bangalore, that was IT. And of course, IT didn't work out great for me, considering that I'm in such a different field now. But I started working for a think tank called the Takshashila Institution. And that's where I began to actually do more public-facing work. So I did a lot of research on geopolitics, especially on China, started getting familiar with, writing for online audiences through that, and of course, began podcasting. And once again, it's one of those really surprising things, right? You would think that in 2017, India, with millions of curious people, would have an English language podcast told by Indians about India's history, but there actually wasn't. And there was this fantastic podcast by Kit Patrick. I think he was at APU at the time, called the History of India podcast. But it didn't really fit the narrative potential that India's history has, and perhaps that's something that only Indian millennials raised on Game of Thrones and a bunch of other pop culture stuff can really do very well. Because I wanted to start my podcast at really where my interest for India's history began, which is in the campaigns of Alexander of Macedon, and I thought it would be interesting to instead write the podcast from the perspective not of Alexander, which of course is the perspective that all the European writers adopt, and instead write it from the perspective of King Puru, who is standing on the banks of the Jhelum in the pouring rain, watching the Greeks and thinking what's going to happen. And the more I thought about it, and the more I kind of experimented with that format, the more that I found that it's something that a lot of people have a thirst for. Especially this idea of taking these relatively dry facts that we learn about India's history, like, okay, yeah, sure, we know that there was such and such, there was a Gupta Empire, the Gupta Empire fought the Huns, for example, but what would it actually have felt like to fight the Huns? What would an army have looked like? What would a battle have looked like? What would a city being sacked by an invading Central Asian horde have looked like? Once you actually put those into like concrete narrative terms, I think that people really enjoy that, and it allows them to engage with history more intuitively. And once I knew that that's something that I personally enjoyed doing so much, it was a pretty logical next step to start writing a book about it. And that, of course, brings us to pretty much where we are today. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So when you set about making these podcasts and then finally settled on writing a very, very lucid, very, I must say, readable history, did you always have a narrative style in mind, or how did you build that? Is it something that you had running for your podcast being transferred into written words, or is it, how did you approach writing a book? Because I somewhere feel that it is a wholly different ballgame.
So to an extent, I think that I really benefited from having a very critical and sharp-eyed editor at Juggernaut. His name was Parth Mehrotra. And Parth was very clear to me from the outset that, Anirudh, look, as you're writing this book, your competition is not any other historian. Your competition is Netflix. Because you're competing for people's attention. It is really that simple for, in the kind of like multimedia world that we live in. It is so easy for us to, if a book isn't holding our attention, just shut it and then open up a screen and then get the dopamines for free, basically. So I had to create a narrative structure that kept pulling readers in, kept rewarding them, and made them want to see what would happen next. And of course, this is something that I only realized after a lot of pain and struggle and turning in this like horrendous 140,000 word draft that took me like months and months to like edit and cut down and streamline. But I think having this idea that, look, I need to be, I can't be taking my readers for granted. I need to speak to the reader as I would speak to anybody, to a friend of mine. I need to tell them a story with people like them. And I need to also show them a world that is so completely alien to ours in so many ways, but is also the very same world that eventually evolved to become ours. And that in itself is like a very interesting idea. So I take the time in the book, as you may have noticed, to pause and say, so this is why I'm going to be talking about this. And this is what it shows you that you would not expect. So this is why I'm pausing this narrative about Pulakeshi fighting all these awesome battles and telling you about temples, because it's because of these wars that these temples were built, and building more temples meant that you could fight more wars. And it's a result of that we have so many temples in India today, right? So structuring it in that way, I think, like really keeps the reader hooked, especially because history can so often feel like, it's just one damn thing after another, like beyond a point, once you zoom out, it just seems like, oh, again and again, is a king is, king has lost his throne, king is fighting for the throne, king is going, conquering this, that. But I think that's because we've become used, especially in India, to separating political history from the rest of history. So if you to look at, for example, Abraham Arali, who is really a great historian, but then all of his books make this very clear distinction that, oh, here's the racy political stuff, and then here's like a section on like society and culture, where I'm going to take all these developments from like hundreds of years and kind of present them to you in this like unchanging mass. And I think that's partly because of this, I think, like an Orientalist tradition that a lot of us Indians inherited, and that the British saw our history as unchanging, and so we think that our history was unchanging and eternally traditional and that kind of thing. But once you actually get into the details, once you understand how the political history is just one aspect of this fantastic, dynamic, changing world that leaves all these footprints in the past, then you've got gold. That's a story that people want to hear, because it's a story that people can relate to, not just because it's a story about Indians, but also because it's a story about people, and people are just fascinating to me. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
So how do you do this? So my people might think that when you approach writing history, it's about sitting in archives, reading these boring, dusty documents, and then just taking numbers, dates, name of the kings, their successors, and things like that. How do you find the story in it? How do you how do you make it into a narrative?
So yes, of course, there is the boring stuff. There is the endless hours sitting and reading about land taxes. Like I've been researching a new book on the Cholas, and like I just spent like a week reading about like taxes paid in land, taxes paid in kind, taxes paid by labor. But while of course it is dry, and it is really the historian's job to extract meaning and look for patterns in what they're seeing. And I really benefit from the fact that there have been so many academic giants who have done such spectacular work that I can then build on. Because when I am reading an inscription, I'm like, okay, so this is the hard data that has been studied by this scholar. So let me try and look also, in addition to the stuff, let me also look at what's being said in between the lines. So, for example, when I was researching Danti Durga, the Rashtrakuta king, who is the focus of one of the chapters of the book, I found this like later inscription by one of the later Rashtrakuta kings, which said that, oh, he went to heaven because the heavenly damsels were insisting that he come there. And I found that very interesting, because like Danti Durga died pretty young, and did he die from unnatural means, or was he unceremoniously bumped off, or did he like die unexpectedly? Now, I can't answer these questions. Nobody can answer these questions because the information does not survive. But what I do in the book is I know that Danti Durga has died. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build him up into this like really interesting guy who's like got all these like new ideas and like is really like shaking up the political structure of the Deccan. And then when the reader doesn't expect it, I just pull the rug out from under them by saying, oh, we don't know, he's dead now. We don't know why it happened, but what I can tell you is that he went to heaven because the heavenly dancers were asking him.
I suppose that's how you make it interesting, and that is how people will connect, in order to just see that these people are not just heroes, they are also just ordinary beings, everyday human beings with emotions and the same kind of feelings and emotions and needs and desires that we have.
Exactly.
Now, if I must, take a sort of detour, if I can read a part of your bio from your website, so I'll read. I tackle nationalist political rewritings of the history of 1/6 of humanity by emphasizing the complicated, relatable lives that our ancestors lived. Now, as we all know, there is a revisionist fervor in the air when it comes to Indian history in the past few years. So, how do you see this? Do you also have these WhatsApp groups and places where you get sent histories by your uncles, or is it just poor people like me?
No. I think that is now one of the most enduring elements of new Indian culture that has like taken root. I've also seen my fair share of, oh, did you know that this shivling grows 12 feet every year? And I once asked the person who sent me, hey, so this temple was built 800 years ago. If it's been growing 1 foot every year, why isn't it 800 feet tall? So yes, I mean, I have had my fair share of run-ins. And as far as how I see this, I mean, there's quite a few ways to like parse it. I think one way to put it is that I think a lot of the public history discourse in India relies on a very uncritical reading of texts. So, for example, the same ideologically and politically motivated actors who have been so insistent on revising India's history rely on a number of sources commissioned by Indian sultans that talk about violence in extremely over the top and extremely gory ways. I mean, there's no denying it. I mean, that's how the texts read, and it's very possible, given that these are times when people had uncontrolled access to power, that a lot of violence absolutely did happen. There's no denying that. But then, what was the scale of the violence? That's a question that's actually difficult to answer, because the text has its own agenda in presenting itself in a particular way. And why is it that it was presenting it that way? It didn't necessarily think that, in the 21st century, some political parties are going to want to rewrite history, and so we have to say this with them in mind. The people who were living in the past didn't think of a future. To them, they were living in the future. They thought they were the most modern and the most intelligent people who ever lived, and everything that they were doing was in response to their own very specific political context. I'm pretty sure that no Sultanate writer thought that at some point there would be Hindu scholars who were reading his texts and then using it to justify discrimination against Muslims in the 21st century who had nothing to do with the violence of centuries past, right? But then if you take the same logic, right, which is this uncritical reading of text, now, either it could be because people aren't aware of historical methods. They aren't aware of the fact that you have to contextualize things before you extract historical information from them. That's one part of it. The second part of it is that some people know better and still insist on reading texts in this particular way. And I think that a really great example of that is if you were to look at the period that I specifically focus on, which is the early medieval period from 600 to 1200. You have all these fantastic texts, all these inscriptions, including in this particular book. I don't know if you can see on my screen, this massive inscriptions of the Pallavas tome that I have. So a lot of this will also have all these claims of, the king did all these violent things, and he went and burned down the city and did all these things. And I present a lot of that in my book. But they will also claim things like, the king was so great and he established dharma and he did all these things that modern day political parties, especially on the right wing, want to pretend that they're doing. Now, what has been really amazing to me as somebody who writes about this, and I say amazing in the most sarcastic and dry way I possibly can, is that when I do write about these things, right, so there's been this very strident insistence that South India's histories are not talked about. So let's talk about South India's histories. But when we do talk about South India's histories, when I've written about South India's histories, I've been accused of distorting the sources. But I'm just pointing out that the sources contain all of this, right? To only look at the violence is incorrect, but also to only look at these claims of, perfect moral law and order is incorrect. And it ties back to the way that we're reading all these texts. If you look at the way that Sultanate texts are read, they're read exclusively for proof of violence. But Sultanate texts also have all this stuff about, the king restored, order to the earth and did all these amazing things. But those are not read. But when it comes to early medieval kingdoms, we don't want to read the violence, but we do want to read all the glorious things the kings are saying about themselves. So the answer to this is not to denigrate one group of people or the other, but rather to recognize that that is the way that power presents itself. That is the nature of power. If you look at political parties today, if you look at political parties in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they're doing the same thing. And they're always much kinder in how they assess themselves. And they're much more interested in curating the facts to present a good image of themselves for particular audiences than the vast majority of people actually are. So we have to keep that in mind. We have to read between the lines and we have to be critical. And I mean, we can just imagine if, 1,000 years from now, somebody were to discover ads made by a corporation or by a government and say, this is proof that they were the most amazing people who ever lived. Or, for example, were to discover the texts only of their political opponents and say that, this proves that they were the most evil people who ever lived. That's such a simplistic way of thinking about the past, to think that people in the past thought in these black and whites is an injustice to the people of the past. We have to recognize that they are complex people like us. They're capable of lying, they're capable of manipulating the truth, and you have to engage with them as people who are just as intelligent, and more importantly, people who are just as morally gray as we are, right? That's really key, I think, in the way that we read these texts. And I think that the fact that we're willing to extend some people the benefit of the doubt, but not others, and it's a very clear divide on religious lines coming from a party and from, intellectuals who are, of course, tied to the government, I think tells you very clearly that this is not the objective revision of history that it's claiming to be. It is,
probably also yeah. In fact, you have answered a couple more of my questions that were to follow up with my other one. But I think that somewhere that we can also see that our post-independent tidying up or snipping of history to fit into certain neat categories, and also to sort of create a uniform history of India, where some aspects of, if you want to talk about religious sectarianism, certain parts of the country is history and things like that, then that has also played a large part in this sort of revisionist history making process, because we have been told that, okay, here is a linear history for you, but there are such wide enough gaps that we can build into it. We can weave narratives into it to fit our story better. We have a Muslim India, then we have a pre-Islamic Hindu India, which these categorizations which do not work well when you go deep into the histories of it.
Exactly. And I think it would be inaccurate to pretend that what we're seeing today is necessarily something new. I think that the scale at which it's happening is probably new, especially its enforcement, its narrative enforcement through like all these like films that are coming out, through all of course armies of like Twitter trolls and social media trolls and so on. I think the scale is unprecedented, but the basic idea that history is something that can and should be rewritten, quote unquote, for the national good. And who defines the national good, of course, is a question that's never asked. I think that's become all too commonplace. And I think, of course, I remember I had like quite a brainwave when I was reading about Akbar, for example. And Akbar, of course, is an important historical figure. He does definitely do a lot of things that profoundly impact South Asia. But Akbar is also a very morally gray figure. If you like read about him, like he does some tremendously and like awfully violent things. But I think it was felt in the decades after independence that in the aftermath of partition, we need to have these national heroes who exemplify, for example, Hindu-Muslim unity. But in that process, we have to go and do this violence to the past. We have to like rewrite him as this different kind of person than he actually was, because that is the bigger picture. But I think that that's actually ended up being short-sighted, because then anybody can do that to any historical figure, and in the end, history ends up losing. I think rather than the solution being that saying that, oh, you had a king who was bad, or you're saying that I had a king who was bad, you also had a king who was bad, or I had a king who was good, you didn't have any kings who were good. Instead of that, if we could just read history in the longue durée, and like actually try and see history from the perspective of the vast majority of people who are living it, and not the 1%. Like imagine if 1,000 years from now, people are fighting over whether Jeff Bezos was better or Elon Musk was better. I mean, this is literally we're forming these fan clubs and fighting over whether this super rich ruler was better or that super rich ruler was better. I think a better way to think about history and why we study history is not to instill a particular kind of sentiment or a particular emotional response, but rather to study history because we want to understand the nature of historical change. And we want to understand why humans evolve and do things the way that they do. And then when you see history from that perspective, when you see history from the perspective of, hey, let me not be overly awed by the way that power is presenting itself, but let me rather actually understand the nature of power, right? Let me understand critically how to identify what worked in societies in the past, what didn't, and how far we've come from them. Because let me tell you, one of the most amazing things that people tell me is that, oh, Nalanda had 10,000 students, Nalanda University, in the medieval period. 10,000 is actually a pretty small number by today's standards, right? Nalanda is one university in a massive population of hundreds of thousands of people, within which only 10,000, and that's not counting that's counting the foreign scholars, are actually studying and getting an education. Something doesn't compute there, because actually, if you think about it, we have actually come much further in, I think, our human responsibility to educate all of society and to move forward as a society today in the 21st century than we did in the medieval period. But I mean, I really forget where I was going with this, because I obviously have a lot of thoughts about it. But I think the basic point that I'm trying to make is that we shouldn't, again, I think, don't look at history for emotions. A history that is confirming all of your biases is not history at all. History challenges you. History challenges you to understand that the world is big, it is huge, it is incredibly diverse, it is incredibly complex, and it changes in really chaotic and unexpected ways. And understanding that we play a small part in all of that is, I think, both profoundly humbling and profoundly empowering.
Right. I have a side question, in the sense that you had in between mentioned how people lived in during those times. So there is this criticism of many of our historians that we tell the story of our rulers, we tell the story of the Rajas, the Sultans. What about the ordinary people? How do you find their story, and how do you fit that? Of course, we discussed, like you said, in a book, we might have in a history book, we might have a section on the culture there, broadly speaking. Whose culture? And how does the lives of ordinary people come into play when it comes to writing history?
That's actually a really, really, really good question, right? And when you just asking whose culture, I remember, like, I think this was the Bangalore Lit Fest, and somebody asked me, I think, something on the lines of, so was this not a golden age, And I was actually being perfectly serious in my follow-up question, where I said, okay, whose golden age? Because I want to understand, right? I wanted the questioner also to kind of inquire within their own mind, when you think of a golden age, who is it a golden age for? And this idea that, classical Indian culture is represented by these particular artifacts from royal courts, I think, does not do justice to just how big the world of ancient and medieval India was. But the tragedy of it is that most of the little people, if I can use that term, left so little trace in the sources that we rely on. And that's a problem with the way that we are thinking about history once again, is that we think of the main historical primary source as being inscriptions. So it is inscriptions that come from temples, that are made by elites, that are trying to speak to other elites. Going back to what I was saying earlier about, like, why are these texts being produced? For whom? They aren't being produced for kings to tell people in the 21st century that, oh, we were so devout, remember us and be devout. They were telling their rivals that, I have the favor of this particular god, and why don't you back off? Or, something on those lines. As for what the little people are doing, we can't answer that question, because a king is not going to be talking about the little people. They aren't even part of his target audience. The answer to that is to do archaeology. And I think that is something that all governments since independence must really take the blame for. Even though there has been some archaeological work on, ancient India, Bronze Age India, Iron Age India, there just has not been enough work on medieval archaeology. Like, I've been, again, for my Chola book, I've been trying to look at the archaeological work that's been done. And even in Gangaikonda Cholapuram, which is at one point the capital of a massive South Indian empire, the excavations that have been done are very tentative. It's only particular parts of the royal palace. We still have no idea of the layout of the entire city. And if you were to look at, for example, popular history writers in Mexico, popular history writers in the US, in the UK, in France, in Spain, they have this like enormous wealth of like concrete detail about like how people live their lives. They have examples of like, the mortars that they were using to like, pound flour, for example. They know what their medieval water mills and that kind of thing look like, but we just have such a vague idea. I remember I had this very profound, like, and humbling moment when like I was looking at a book about Indian sculpture, and for the very first time I actually saw pictures of chisels that have been excavated from Mamalapuram, which is this great Pallava site in South India. And I was just staring at those chisels because up till this point, I had never actually seen medieval tools that were used to build these colossal temples and so on that occupy such a big place in our imagination today. And I was just imagining the hands that would have held this chisel. Who was this person? Was he like tall or was he short? Was he like, what did he look like? Did he have like had he ever lost a finger from like chiseling things? What was his family like? Where did he learn his stuff from? Do he like to do things in a particular way? Who are these people? They just don't survive in the historical record because they are completely overshadowed by the people who ruled over them. And I sincerely hope this is something that is changing to an extent. Like I think, especially in Kerala, there's been some fantastic work on Pattanam excavations, just incredible stuff. And we're learning such counterintuitive things about like what people actually lived like. And why can't we do that for the rest of India? And why can't we actually just put aside all these like inane debates about whether this king was better, that king was better, and say, let's just find out what these people actually lived like. And I really want to see, I want to see a day when India's popular history is as dynamic and thriving as it is in the rest of the world, because you will see like, comics made by young Japanese kids, young Chinese kids, young Mexican kids, where they know what, like, for example, the city of Tenochtitlan looked like because they have the archaeology, they know exactly the layout of the city, and then they can draw it. And they make these like beautiful comics, like, about the fall of the Aztec Empire, or, all these, they write historical fiction, fantasy fiction. It's an investment to get to know your history better because it pays off again and again by creatively inspiring people. But I think that in India, we have, and this is something that all of us since independence and before, I think we collectively bear the brunt of this, is that we have not seen history as something that is meant to, to inspire creatively, but rather something that's meant to inspire politically. And I think it's very important to try and make that shift by doing imaginative things and writing and creating imaginative stories about the past. And I think that was also like very much a major motive in the way that I wrote Lords of the Deccan.
So I was just lost in a thought in between. You were mentioning Gangaikonda Cholan. When you come to the Cholas and when you think of their conquest to the north, this idea of a southern empire, a South India, a distinct South Indian history sort of vanishes. It's not that we have these neat packages where we have South Indian empires and North Indian empires. Here we have a king who is celebrated for having brought the Ganges to Tamil Nadu, or at least to have conquered up till, or have done some kind of conquest up till the Ganges. And I find it interesting that you have used the word Southern India instead of South India in your subtitle, where you are talking about. Was there a conscious choice?
That was a conscious choice. The idea being that I think very often when we say South India, the image that pops into our minds is usually the southern tip of the subcontinent, which is only Tamil Nadu and Kerala.
Okay.
But southern India gives you the impression of the entire peninsula. And I think it's very important that we see that as actually a very vast and very interconnected geopolitical region. Because the history of the Deccan is not confined to the Deccan. The Deccan especially is a place where is actually very interested in its entire vicinity and is constantly looking out and like doing things with every part of its world. And incidentally, of course, so is Tamilakam. So especially so are the Cholas. And like what's interesting to me about the Cholas is that, you said their history is not necessarily a uniquely South Indian story. their history isn't actually uniquely Indian story either, because they don't necessarily see themselves using this modern political identity. And of course, that makes intuitive sense, but I find that we very often don't question this, right? Very often we're like, oh, he was an Indian king. Of course, he was an Indian king, but is that how they actually saw him themselves? Because we have to keep in mind that, the main port that the Cholas used, Nagapattinam, is only about, I think, 150 or 200 kilometers from Anuradhapura, the Sri Lankan capital. Right. And the distance between Tanjavur, the primary Chola city, and Madurai, the primary Pandya city, is 150 kilometers. So in their world, Sri Lanka is very much a part of it. Sri Lanka is not like this whole different country where you had to get a passport to go to. It's like literally a hop, skip, and a jump across the ocean. And I think that's something that actually continues to this day, and that there is really a lot more exchange, a lot more movement of people and goods between South India and Lanka than we think. And the same applies also especially to how the Cholas saw across the Indian Ocean. Because you have repeated examples of the Cholas engaging with Burma, engaging with Cambodia, engaging with Srivijaya in Indonesia, and of course, parts of Malaysia, and of course, engaging with China. And I don't think that they would necessarily have constrained themselves politically, like in their imagination. They would not have seen themselves as part only of South Asia, but they would have seen themselves in this like very different kind of way, which actually sees these people across the seas as their peers, which I think is very in our post-partition world, in our post-British Raj world, where we have these like very strong boundaries, these very strong national identities, and there's very clear like sense that our people are better. No, actually our people are better. Like every single nation in South and Southeast Asia says this, and it's so tragic to somebody who reads about this medieval world, because in the medieval world, and this is so paradoxical, in a world that was not as connected as ours, their sense of themselves was much bigger than ours is, which is so shocking.
Speaking of Cholas, have you watched Ponniyin Selvan?
Yes, I have.
And do you feel that movies like that, of course it was based on a fictional work, there are borrowings from actual history, but that is it is primarily a fictional work. Do you think movies like that would help in the process of this regaining of lost histories?
Actually, I'm not sure. I definitely think that movies are a very powerful way to tell the past. And of course, this is a free society. I really hope that the kind of movie that I would like to see is made someday. But I don't think that these are the kind of movies that necessarily help. Because see, while they do increase the name recognition of the Cholas, the image they promote of the Cholas is not one that the Cholas themselves would recognize. Because the Cholas in their texts see themselves in a very different way, present themselves in a very different way from the way that Ponniyin Selvan does. And in a lot of ways, that's actually like pretty anachronistic, and it actually flies in the face of what their history actually was. Now, I find the Cholas completely fascinating because the region in which they emerge is actually one of the most unique places in medieval India at the time. So at that point of time, especially the Kaveri floodplain, but also Tamilakam by large, was actually a very multi-centric and very hierarchical place. In that it wasn't just about the kings, but right down to village assemblies, people had a tremendous amount of like local autonomy. And for the most people, what their village and county assemblies was deciding was actually more important than what the king was doing. The king was off, fighting his wars and all that, but all the humdrum daily stuff where figuring out whether the irrigation tank is like up to the right level, or if you have to like build a new bund, or you have to dredge it more. These are things that most people are actually concerned with. They aren't like sitting around and singing songs about how great the Chola king is, which they do in Ponniyin Selvan, by the way. And also, I mean, by depicting the Cholas as, they spread simply through like war and conquest and being awesome and swinging their swords at people and like all those things, like, yes, of course, war was a big part of it. But first of all, they didn't fight war the way that Ponniyin Selvan shows it. But also, how do I put this? They're much more complex than that. Their world is much more than just the court politics. The way that they think about religion, the way they think about conquest, the way they think about expansion, the way they think about rulership and all that. I think the way that Ponniyin Selvan depicts it, and of course, this because it's a product of its times. In the 1950s, Kalki Krishnamurti, the author of Ponniyin Selvan, needed Tamil nationalist heroes. He's a freedom fighter. He's living in a time when Hindi is being imposed in South India. He needs Tamil heroes, and so he chooses to write the Cholas in a particular way. But is that necessarily the way that we still need to think about them today? Do they still need to be heroes, or can we just appreciate them as people who changed, who are morally complex, morally gray people, who did morally gray things in a morally gray world? A film, I think, especially a big budget Bollywood film, is very afraid of moral grayness. It's got to be very black and white, to the point where its protagonists and antagonists are literally dark-skinned and fair-skinned. And I was very, like, if you look at the Pandyas, for example, in Ponniyin Selvan, they're all dark-skinned. And I was like, they look the same as the Cholas, right? They're like from like a few kilometers away. They're the same people. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. I mean, I do understand the argument, at a surface level, yes, it does seem like it helps people recognize the Cholas better, but it helps them recognize and think about the Cholas in a way that's not actually historical. And whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, I suppose, can be debated for hours on end. But at least from my limited perspective of, is this going to improve historical understanding? I would say not necessarily.
Okay. Now, with that answer, I think my next question will be a bit antithetical to what you have been talking about.
Sure.
Have you ever wondered whether, if you were to be a historical figure, any of the kings that you have read about, that you have written about, who would that be? Will there ever be such a person that you would want to be?
I think there would be too stressful a life for me, honestly. It's I would not want to be worrying about court politics and who's going to assassinate me, or the thing is, here's the thing. Here's what I find very interesting about some of the more recent kings, right? Any royal, any position of absolute authority, it of course comes with the stress and all that, and fine, maybe of course kings had their ways of dealing with stress. They had access to finest booze, finest drugs, whatever they needed. But I think more than that, I think what really terrifies me about power is how it alienates you from people, because you're responsible for people, completely responsible. Their lives literally hang on your decisions. And also, by extension, how do I put this? You don't fully see them as people anymore. Instead, they're pawns. You have to move them around. You have to get certain services from them. They have to be in a particular hierarchy. They have to treat you and talk to you in a certain way. But then, because you're so powerful, that also means that people try to use you for your power. And imagine, people talk about being a king and having 10 wives as some kind of ideal state. Imagine not knowing if any of your wives love you, or if they're all just married to you for the politics.
Or might just kill you one day.
Yeah. What would that do to a person? How would it feel to not be able to go and unburden yourself to someone without knowing if they're going to use it against you in some plot that they're fostering? And of course, there's all the other stuff about historical disease, and I would die within 5 minutes because I'd be blind without my glasses.
Same with me. Yeah. I think it's Yuval Noah Harari or some who said that many of the historical kings that we talk about, they would not have had the basic facilities that we enjoy today.
Yeah.
So the kind of medical care and other things. What about? Have you ever thought about something like television series, something along the lines of Game of Thrones, that could be a bit more complex than movies like Ponniyin Selvan that can do justice to the kind of history that we should be reading about? This is just a movie and series buff asking questions about possibilities of Netflix series on Indian history. But what is your take on it?
So I think OTT platforms are figuring out that this can be a thing. I think within the last few years, we had like 2 Mughal-inspired historical shows. We had Empire, and of course, we had more recently Taj, both of which I think didn't do very well. But I think that's not an issue with the historical format itself, but rather the way that they're being made. Because, I mean, honestly, I have read enough about Mughal history. I'm not enamored with them by any stretch of the term, but I do find them interesting because they are early modern Indian kings, and there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of insane stuff that happens. I mean, you have Mughal emperors who can't pay their troops, and so like open other gates of the palace and like let the troops come in and like ransack whatever they can as payment. Imagine that in a TV show. Like that's something. Imagine a TV show what this like late Mughal Begum Samru, who was sitting like not far from Delhi, who was originally this dancing girl who like becomes basically a warlord, hiring like European mercenaries, building a Indian Catholic church. Like there's all this like crazy stuff, but we always get the same stuff about, oh, did you know Babur was actually a feminist and he was really nice? Or, oh, did you know that there was this woman called Anarkali and Jahangir loved her, but actually Akbar also loved her. So, there's so many stories to be told, and I really, really hope that the creative space will like get more and more engaged with like all these things that can be said. And like I said, like this is the issue with like seeing history as something that's meant to inspire politically instead of creatively, is that people will only make historical stuff that conform to their political bias, but in the process they end up losing sight of the fact that historical figures are people. And I think the most popular and most globally influential historical stuff. So if you look at the work of Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese director, if you look more recently at like Ridley Scott, or if you look at, of course, at Game of Thrones, whether it's not exactly historical, but at least it feels historically authentic in the first few seasons. Why? Because it shows its protagonists as people who make mistakes and who pay for those mistakes. Nobody ever makes a mistake in Ponniyin Selvan. It's all these perfectly intelligent people who have all these plots and everything works out well and everything is great in the end, but nobody pays for making mistakes. And I think what I liked about Ponniyin Selvan 1 is that, the Vandiyadevan is being chased everywhere. I'm like, you don't see that in a lot of movies. And that's actually really interesting because it kind of flips the gaze and it makes the world feel like it has stakes. But in Ponniyin Selvan 2, because now we have to be like, yes, everybody's awesome. Everybody has plot armor. The stakes aren't there anymore. And just a bunch of like incoherent thoughts. So any Netflix executives who are watching, please feel free to reach out to me. I will say.
So you are interested.
I am absolutely.
We can think of something. We can hopefully see something soon.
Yes, I really hope so.
Okay. I think we can end on a lighter note. If I may ask, what are you reading right now?
I'm actually reading 2 fascinating books. The first is Toby Wilkinson's Tutankhamun's Trumpet, a story of Egypt in 100 objects. A fascinating book because he looks at 100 objects from the tomb of Tutankhamun and uses them to trace out elements of like Egyptian society and politics and culture, like going all the way back to when hunter-gatherers were still a thing. Fantastic book. The next thing I'm reading is called The Rise and Reign of the Mammals by Steve Brusatte. This is fantastic, like natural history of like mammal evolution, like going back to about 300 million years or so. And yeah, that's the kind of thing that like makes you realize that, wow, we're just these little hairless apes on this rock hurtling through space. Can we not be so mean to each other? Can we just appreciate the wonder of being alive in this enormous universe?
All right. I can tell you what I am reading. I have to confess, though, that I'm not done with this book. So I'm reading your wonderful book. It's a lucid, it's a wonderful read. I have to say, I recommend this to everybody who's watching. Have a nice day.
Thank you all.